Hello, this is Niswander, and welcome to the Nowman Show. The name of this panel is Creating a New Economy, Progress, Democracy, and Guaranteed Income. Before I introduce the panelists, I have a few thoughts. There's so much wealth, trillions of dollars of wealth created every year. More than 50% of that wealth each year goes to the top 1%. 40% of the U.S. population can no longer afford basic necessities, and a $500 emergency is a difficult thing to achieve. So what can we do? This is an emergency, and speaking of emergency, let's get right into this. In my panel, my first guest, Alan Minsky, is the Executive Director of the Progressive Democrats of America. He is also producer of the Nation podcast, Start Making Sense with John Wiener. Lawrence Cohen, or Larry Cohen as he likes to be called, is the founder of buildthefloor.org and an advocate for universal basic income. Gentlemen, welcome to the Nowman Show.
Great to be here.
How are you?
I'm good.
You doing good?
Yeah, been an active day, been out and about in Southern California.
That's
Nice
fantastic.
day,
Yeah, today was the day that we're recording this was the day that Bernie Sanders had his official kickoff, so we can talk about that, and we can talk about Andrew Yang, which, by the way, this is the day it also is broadcasting on the Arroyo channel, the day we're taping this, my interview with Andrew. So, Larry, how are you?
I'm doing great.
Fantastic.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So we're going to start with Alan. Alan, so we have a huge mess. That's where I'll start. How are we going to start this process? We need to strategize how we're going to maneuver through these next couple of years. We also need to create coalitions on the ground and one-on-one. What do you suggest the first step should be?
Well, I think there's a few things that people need to recognize. First of all, obviously we need to change governmental policy. If you look at what's happened in the global economy and in the American economy in the post-World War II period, there was a big shift with Ronald Reagan in 1980. There was a shift overseas with Margaret Thatcher in 1979. And the sort of free market will solve everything ideology that was put forward really got solidified and unchallenged once you had Tony Blair leading the Labor Party and Bill Clinton the Democratic Party.
Exactly.
So you had a consensus for what in global terms was called the neoliberal economic system. Now, if you look at the neoliberal economic system, how was that put in place? Yes, we live in a society where corporations, wealthy people have a lot of power, but how that was achieved was through shifts in governmental policy. In other words, the economic right recognized they needed to control the mechanisms of government to create the regulated market that worked for their ends. So now we have to win governmental power and change the rules of the way the economy is structured so that we can have greater economic, we won't have the kind of wealth inequality, we'll have more equitable distribution of wealth. And again, this society does generate a tremendous amount of wealth, so if we achieve that, we can go back to people having lives that are not under such duress. They can lead middle-class lives. We can have things like 6-week vacations, and as technology develops, 8 weeks of vacation and 3 months of vacation.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't have to labor so much, and we can have comfortable middle-class lives. We can all do better with all the abundance that we have in this society, but it's going to take controlling the mechanisms of government. And the opening that we have in this country remains the democratic process. And it's tough because the Democratic Party has consistently betrayed the needs and interests of the general population of the American people. But really, with Bernie Sanders and the organization that I'm head of, Progressive Democrats of America, played a big role in this because we were the sole national organization that was involved in drafting Bernie Sanders to run for president in 2013. And as our name betrays, we were doing so that he run as a Democrat. And paradoxically, Ralph Nader, and by the way, I've been the executive producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Nader was discouraging to run as a Democrat, as he had not done in 2000 famously, saying, Bernie Sanders, if you run as a Democrat, you're going to be out by Iowa and New Hampshire, you'll be done, no one will remember you. If you go as an independent, you can go all the way through the spring, the summer, the fall, your voice will be heard. Well, of course, there was a lot of negative impact from, depending on how you interpret the historical moment in 2000, from Nader's run. Bernie saw that, saw how Nader became marginalized after that, chose to run as a Democrat, even though he'd been a lifelong independent. And now, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez getting elected in 2018 as a Democrat, not an independent like Sanders, but an actual Democrat, the Democratic Party is a space of contestation where you have the neoliberal centrists and you have now the social democratic, democratic socialist left, which most of the public agrees with.
Yes.
If you look at the opinion polls
Even
issue by
on Fox
issue.
News town hall.
There we go, even on a Fox News town hall. And again, there's a lot of opening up and discourse about things like a federal job guarantee program, universal basic income, that were unheard of or unthought of really before you had the rise of Bernie Sanders. You can also maybe argue Jeremy Corbyn in
Yes.
the UK as well.
Yes.
So there's been, at least in these two Anglophone countries, rising social democratic left. Unexpectedly, I think the centrists are surprised by that. Of course, they were also surprised by Trump's election too, but things are changing, and that's because the population is dissatisfied with the economic status quo, particularly after the market crash. They tried to put Humpty Dumpty back together again,
Yeah.
but they did it with even greater
right.
austerity for the masses and even
That's
more
right.
wealth only going to the 1%.
Exactly.
So how we change things, I do think at the moment, at this hour, the space of contestation is within the Democratic Party.
Because, well, that's the structure that we have.
We have a
the
two-party
system,
right.
and we don't have, it's
Right.
not open
And
like the parliamentary process.
And I don't
is.
waste my time trying to analyze exactly why the American history is always, the electoral system has collapsed into a two-party system, but it always has.
Well, economically, I mean, your father predicted 50 years before the,
Well, that's the market crash.
That's
Yeah.
the market crash, yeah.
Sure,
So from that standpoint, I mean, wasn't it something like stability comes through destability? Is that what he was talking about?
Yeah, I suppose his famous quote is that stability causes instability, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Or stability is destabilizing. Yeah.
But there were all kinds of warning signs. I mean, and nobody was paying attention. It's like, when Robert Scheer was here in the studio, that's when I learned about those two policies of the Bill Clinton administration that were disastrous at the end of his term.
Yeah, and then the Bush-Cheney ownership.
And then 8 years later,
policies.
here we are with the second largest crash in the history of economics, or we could say, capitalism in the modern age. So, and then, there's so many millions of people. I mean, I know that personally, from Occupy, they lost their homes, people lost their careers, their jobs, their savings, their retirement. I'm one. And nothing's been done. Literally nothing's been done. And you have people like Nancy Pelosi that says, nah, it's just a few people that are it's just these 5 new women, that's all there is. Like, no, because I'm a progressive. Like, no, you're not. Because if you were, we would be talking, you would be talking about universal basic income. You would be for Medicare for All, not just Medicare for America, which is not the same thing.
Sure.
Do you know what I mean? And so we need short-term solutions and we need long-term solutions.
Well, I think okay, when you look at the Sanders program, right, which, again, you see a bunch of politicians who've never supported those policies feeling they need to run supporting those policies within the Democratic Party. Oddly, like Amy Klobuchar is sort of the only one who's honest enough to acknowledge that she's not with that program. And of course, Biden will probably never say exactly what he's for.
Exactly.
And so, but to achieve the changes we're talking about, and that Sanders is talking about, does represent a direct frontal challenge to the logic of the system as it currently exists. Right? Because now, why did the forces of the economic right reorganize the regulations of government to create the neoliberal system? Well, that's the old capitalist game. They thought that was the way in which they could maximize their profitability. And in the 21st century, you can look at it also in terms of increasing their wealth, their political power through their wealth, and more conventionally, the size of their investment portfolios. So if you go counter to that, if you do not have constant tax breaks for the wealthy, if you do not have constant deregulation, if you have redistributive economics, if you have Medicare for All, which, FIRE, right. Is finance, insurance, and real estate. These are these 3 sectors that are core to the logic of the financialization of everything. Well, you pull insurance out of that, right, all of a sudden, and you have a nationalized health system like Medicare for All, that undercuts some stock portfolios right there. So again, this runs counter to the logic of the system, how it's operated, and the powers that be will fight, kicking and screaming, and use every wedge they can to make sure that that cannot happen. And that's why I think a beautiful part of the Bernie Sanders campaign, and this even distinguishes himself, say, from Elizabeth Warren, who is a tremendous progressive. And we in PDA absolutely love Elizabeth Warren. But if you're going to create the changes, Sanders is correct. His historical analysis is correct. You need legions of people, millions of people
right.
themselves bought into it. So the not me, us. When he says that, he knows that he means it.
That's
and
right.
that's a bond between him and his supporters, that they will be mobilized because they know that the status quo will fight against any shift off of the system as it operates. Because their achievement of profitability, they think it's difficult. They think pulling any thread out of it, and then they're jeopardized.
Well, see, that's one of the things that people were attracted to, you know, obviously, because that whole that shifted, you know, when he went on the campaign trail to, you know, to campaign for Hillary Clinton. That support waned because people were not focused on Bernie Sanders. They were focused on those points you're talking about, like when millions of people stand together to demand change. You know what I mean? And change never happens from the top down. Do you know what I mean? Those were the things that people were resonating with, and they're still resonating with. Now, short-term solutions, you know, this has been discussed. The first time I brought this up on this show was in 2015 when Jimmy Dore was sitting in here. And I did like an improv thing with him, like, what do you think about universal basic income? Oh, I like that, you know. And then I had a whole episode on it in 2017, I believe, with a fellow occupier, Franz Pierre. So now I've interviewed this week Andrew Yang, and that episode is out. So Larry, you have your own website called buildthefloor.org. Why do you think that universal basic income is important as a short-term solution, or how?
Well, I think what we're dealing with is a fundamental transformation of our economy. We're dealing with an incredible amount of technology that's being developed, and in a world where a system is designed that could be a benefit for everybody. That technology would allow people to labor less. That technology would be able to do the labor, that people would be able to become more free to go pursue other kinds of work. I think we're actually having a giant conversation over what work is, the definition of work, what we think work is to ourselves and to our community. And the technology that we have today is, instead of a system where that's a benefit, it's at a cost at millions of people's jobs today, and will be tens of millions of jobs in the future. It sounds like, by all major reports, at least a third, if not a greater amount of jobs can or will be automated in the next 10 to 12 years. And so we're talking, at the same time, like you mentioned, 40% of people can't afford a $400 major expense, emergency expense, and 60% of people can't afford a $1,000 expense.
Yes.
So in a world where we have all this technology and we have this much inequality and lack of security for the vast majority of our population, the system has to change. And so
Yes.
I believe fundamentally, having something like a universal basic income creates a new floor of security, which is why I call my site Build the Floor, because it's about creating this new foundation, this new floor for all Americans to be able to build a purpose-driven life with the technology that we are developing collectively and can use collectively, deploying that wealth and prosperity to all Americans, and allowing each American to pursue the kind of work and different kinds of work that will make their life more meaningful. That doesn't mean that all jobs will go away that we consider today, but we expand the definition. We think childcare needs to be considered more important work, because it is. It's one of the most
Absolutely.
valuable kinds of work people do, but because there's no exchange of money for that service to take care of your own family, to take care of your family, it's seen as not important. So we need to have a real conversation about what work is, redefine what work is, incentivize people to do different kinds of work, and do the kind of work that robots can't replace. We should allow robots to do the labor and allow people to do the living.
You know, it's an interesting point that you make there, because I know Professor Richard Wolff, who I consider one of my biggest mentors, he talks about, you know, switching to a 20-hour work week. You know, how the unions, you know, worked so very hard to get that down to 40, right? But now with the robots, you know, taking over a lot of the chores that people do, like in factories and things like that already, it's already begun. I mean, we're seeing it, especially in Europe and Japan. So something's got to be done. So he suggests, you know, he has something to say about UBI, but he also talks about going down to 20 hours a week. If people work 20 hours a week, then just think, you could have that extra time, you know, with your family, your sports, your music, you know, or as I agree with him, you could create worker cooperatives with your friends and do things that you want to do on the side to make money too if you want. There's nothing wrong with that.
It expands the idea of what people could be doing with their time and their energy and their focus and their passion. It expands the idea of what we should be doing with our lives, right? And isn't that the whole point? Like that should be freeing us to go do that kind of work. And as you were saying, like you say you work for 20 hours, but taking care of your community and exploring and learning and participating in civic society, those are technically kinds of work. Like that's not easy. You don't just sit around and it magically happens, but that's work too, but we don't consider that work today. You consider that leisure. And so we've set up a system where we don't get to do that kind of work because it doesn't pay. And so let's, like you said, be able to spend some time laboring in the traditional economy that we consider with paid labor, and then spend more time doing the kinds of work that we really want to enjoy. I
agree, and it's like we've had some conversations in this studio here about how science fiction kind of conveys what the future is going to be like. And as a kid, when I was watching the Jetsons, I didn't think about it. But when I watched later, I think George Jetson only worked like 10 hours a week or 20 hours a week.
Damn, in the Flintstones, they worked a lot, but that was the past. That was the past. So you can see the evolution there, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The Flintstones to the Jetsons, Well.
But it makes, exactly. And then, of course, Star Trek, people, you didn't see the exchange of money. Well, maybe Deep Space Nine you did, but, sorry, I'm a nerd. But, the thing about it is, this is realistic. This is real. I mean, with AI and all this kind of stuff, things are changing dramatically. And I personally think that Americans don't understand in general, I'm not saying everyone, but in general, they don't understand, they're not psychologically prepared for what's coming. And our government should be playing a key role in that, in educating people and preparing people for this.
Well, I think actually, I would say that people are preparing for this because they're dealing with it right now.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
For those who are
people who are aware.
Exactly, people who are really aware are those who are unable to find a 40-an-hour job that pays the living wage, that provides benefits, that they're working in the gig economy, barely making ends meet, constantly stressed, constantly insecure, healthcare costs going through the roof, unable to pay their housing, unable to take care of their families. Like those are people who are living that experience today, and there are tens of millions of people, and I think that's why you're seeing from across the spectrum politically that the people are ready to speak out. People are ready for bigger, bolder solutions like basic income, like a jobs guarantee, or just other ways of addressing these large-scale problems that people are living in their lives today, and they see it happening, and they want to do something about it. They want to support people who are going to do something concretely to tackle that kind of a level of an issue.
Well, and we have to create coalitions with different groups. Like, for instance, there's the Democratic Socialists of America. There's the Green Party out there, although I heard there's some dysfunctional issues there, but they have a great platform. There is also the Party for Socialist Liberation.
Sure, the Green Party, for instance, had the Green New Deal as part of its platform.
And the coalition that they created in 2007 for the original Green New Deal. So that's not a new thing. You should give kudos to them, and Baraka and Stein, and those, they contributed a lot to that awareness, and bringing us to this point now. So in connecting all the dots with all these coalitions and bring people together to demand these changes, as Bernie says, when people have asked me, like, well, who do you support for the election? I'm not even really thinking in terms of personalities. I'm thinking in terms of strategies more than anything. Like, so when somebody says millions of people stand together to demand change, I'm for that. Oh, Bernie Sanders said that. Or when somebody says, we need to stop all these interventionist wars. This is crazy, our military-industrial complex. Oh, I agree with that. Tulsi Gabbard said that. Or when Andrew Yang says, well, we got to start somewhere. We can work on this as time goes on, but let's start with $1,000, and let's make sure that Amazon and Netflix, contribute to this freedom dividend. Oh, I agree with that. Andrew Yang said that. Or Marianne Williamson says we need the dynamics of love in our world, in our political system. I agree with that. So, and I think Mike Gravel would be good for the debate stage too, don't you think?
I think he's fantastic, but I think that the two teenagers really should be up there because they really let loose on their Twitter account, and I recommend anybody read those things because they're absolutely hilarious and spot on.
The who?
The two teenagers who actually run his Twitter account. His campaign is actually an agreement between himself and these two teenagers who effectively drafted him, and he allowed them to use his Twitter account.
Oh, that's
so
fantastic.
They're incredibly caustic attacks on the other candidates. You might be familiar with the famous line from 1984 that the future is a human face being stomped on by a jackboot for eternity. That's the future in George Orwell's 1984. So he asks, what would the future be like under Cory Booker? And he says it would be a human face being stamped on by a jackboot for eternity, interrupted periodically by speeches by Cory Booker in which you're asked to dream.
Wow, that's
So
fantastic.
it doesn't pull any punches.
Yeah.
Wow.
Anyway, and it's just about as bad for everybody else. So, except Bernie didn't seem to get in there, so I think that shows what these two teenagers think about Bernie. They like him a lot. But
Yeah.
Gravel has been drafted by these two teenagers. So
That's
it's just
fantastic.
a
How
fact.
old are they?
18 and 19,
Oh,
respectively.
that's fantastic.
Yeah, yeah.
But as you were speaking, that there's a broad range of Democrats running who are recognizing the scope of the issue, that the issues that we're dealing with, and they want to provide different solutions. And I'm more in favor of universal basic income, the freedom dividend under Andrew Yang, but they all recognize that they need to come to the plate with big ideas to tackle these major issues that people are living today. And I think that's why we're experiencing this kind of discussion.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and I actually, while I am favorably disposed towards the universal basic income, I'm more of an advocate for a federal jobs guarantee at a living wage. And at a living wage, of course, because I think in specific, there are a number of socially necessary goods and services that are not provided by the marketplace. You look at childcare, you look at education,
That's
you look
right.
at the number of teachers, and if you set it all at a living wage, then that would mean nobody would work for sub-living wage jobs. If you have set them at living wage where everybody gets universal health care as well, that again, nobody's going to work at a job that's below that when that is the federal job guarantee. And of course, that's part of Sanders' program as a subset of the Green New Deal that he endorses and that Ocasio-Cortez and Markey put forward. Can I ask a question too? What's your
Absolutely.
sense of a universal basic income? I mean, when you look out at the macroeconomy of the United States, universal basic income, so every adult above a certain age would get a certain amount of money per month.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense of the range that you would advocate for?
I personally think that the range that Andrew Yang commits to, which is about $1,000 a month, simply because we need to start somewhere, and that is roughly $1,000 a month, about $12,000 a year for an 18-year-old or older, is about the point of the poverty line as how we define it. So, you know, would I like it to be greater at some point? Should it rise with the increase in productivity? Should we be pegged to that, or at least inflation? Absolutely. But we need to have a starting point, and that's how we created a starting point, is the poverty line as we've defined it. Is that the best definition? We could debate about that, but we need some place to start. And so that's a logical starting point. Also, it's a nice round number for people to get behind and recognize as like, that makes sense. They can translate that amount into how it affects them in their everyday lives.
And it is literally universal. And by the way, I do advocate for universality. So it would actually, so Mitt Romney would get the money as well as the people who are currently homeless. And of course, the society, when it talks about the ways in which it's just askew, obviously here in Southern California, the homelessness crisis is
it's
just,
just
you know,
appalling.
at every intersection. It's a signifier of a society that's gone off the rails. It's utterly appalling. And I think, of course, it's a very compassionate approach to macroeconomic considerations and the way that they impact individuals and individual households and society. However, I am primarily an advocate for, and the reason, by the way, the universality, it might strike people as being particularly unfair. Of course, if you have progressive taxation, you take most of that money back from Mitt Romney.
Depending on how
exactly.
you
That's
implement
right.
it, it would probably come back. So those who own, you know, Amazon stock and whatever, those people would be probably paying more into a system with basic income than they would be getting out of it. But if they were to lose it all tomorrow, they would always have a basic income as a starting point, and
That's
it
right.
simplifies the system. It takes away the stigma between the people who get it and people who don't, and it recognizes everybody with a universal sense of dignity and making sure that we recognize each other's humanity. And I think that
That's
level
right.
of trust needs to be brought back into the conversation.
That's true.
And also, while I live in Southern California and I love it, of course, $1,000 goes a lot further in Topeka, Kansas than
And
it does
Iowa and West
right,
Virginia,
Right, and those parts of
Oklahoma.
the country need those. And of course, that would be the same with the federal job guarantee at a set living wage nationally, because again, these parts of the country are quite economically depressed, the Rust Belt, et cetera, much of the country, other than the coasts and the major metropolitan areas. So both the federal job guarantee and universal basic income would be addressing that component of American inequality as well.
And that I see that, you know, as a short-term kind of solution that we could play with. Just like, and that's where one of the things I agree with Yang on is that we got to start somewhere because people need money. I certainly know that feeling. I know a lot of people that know that feeling.
Well, don't forget also with the universal health care, Medicare for All,
Yeah.
and with federal jobs guarantee, you know, one of the things that locks people into jobs that they hate is the fact that they're scared of losing their health care.
That's right. That's right.
And so if you have that component of being able to shift jobs, look for something that's more satisfying for your person, being locked in. How many millions of people are locked into their jobs out of fear of losing their health care?
Exactly, and they don't like their jobs.
Unbelievable.
I know.
Right. But also, there's incredible paradoxes here, because if you go back any point in human history before the post-World War II era in technological societies, humanity would look at our society and be like, what the hell are they all working for?
Exactly, that's right.
1 to 2% of the population is involved in direct agricultural production, which used to be, since the hunter and gathering phase of humanity, has been the primary labor that people were involved in. Just as recently as the early Roosevelt years, I think the majority of Americans had some direct relationship to agricultural production.
And my Swiss grandfather was a farmer until he retired.
All over the place. So now, that's no longer the case at all. And yet, if you clearly look out at our society, people are working harder than ever. And the technology that you mentioned as well is working against us. All of us cannot get away from our god-awful bosses because they have constant access to us through these unbelievably fantastic devices that we carry around that are themselves signifiers of humanity's incredible ingenuity. But they are traps for people because the boss can follow them everywhere. It's like your own personal panopticon that you're locked inside.
Exactly.
And all of these strategies can break you out of that. And at the root of all of them is the necessity of people becoming involved in the political system, having faith that their activity can, and it's going to take a while. We have a Democratic Party that is a machine-driven Democratic Party.
Driven by money.
Right, absolutely, 100%.
And it's blatantly money. Because we have Citizens United that allows that to happen.
Well, right, and the reason they went along with that is because the belief was from the DLC years forward, the Clinton-Gore years forward, was that they could compete, they could organize the party in a way that they would get a sector of capital supporting them, that along with the labor unions that are largely pliant and obsequious, right, would support the Democratic Party, and that would basically balance out the money block of the Republican Party. And so they are as wedded to big money as the Republicans were, and of course the interests of the working class completely lost in that. So it takes actual people power and really an educated population and I think that's what happens with a movement like Sanders, is people are learning the ropes, people are seeing which of the Democratic Party elected officials, because let's face it, the Republican Party, that is a lockdown machine driven by money. They are in lockstep. If you break with them for 1 second, you're gone.
That's
you
right.
can't, look what happened to Flake. Flake's gone. Right? And so, maybe not a perfect example, but basically they march in total 100% lockstep, set by Alex, set by Mitch McConnell, et cetera. The Democratic Party you can play in, but it is largely a machine-driven, money-driven party, where the base of the party supports these kind of policies, but the elected officials across the country are overwhelmingly in the Democratic Party, in the machine, in the money machine.
And that's what we have to be bold,
right? Very
and
bold.
Stand up to it, and that's why we need coalitions to address it, as Bernie says. And it's going to be millions now. Hundreds of thousands is not enough, obviously. He says millions standing together, demanding change. That's exactly what needs to happen. Right?
Well, I think we're in
we need
crisis.
To wrap this up.
A crisis is a terrible opportunity to waste, right?
Yeah.
And we're in the middle of the crisis right now. And I think you're seeing that with the level of engagement on the political side, the rallies that Andrew Yang is getting, that many of the candidates are drawing attention to because of these ideas. So it's a matter of having these conversations, bringing up the ideas that are attractive to people who recognize these solutions as taking meaningful steps toward improving their lives, and bringing them into the coalition to have that conversation, to have that civic engagement, get people rallied and fired up to take action, to vote and to go door to door and to get people involved, because people's lives are on the line in a number that we really can't even reckon with, in the tens of millions. And I think that's what's going to lead this revolution, whichever candidate gets picked to run.
It could be half the country, which is hundreds of millions personally. But we got to wrap this up real quick. So real short closing statements. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for being on the Nowman show. And I have, before this episode is over, I do have to say, left wing of the Labor Party's manifesto, democratize the economy. Check it out. And wait for the Yellow Vest, because it's coming. Anyway, so Yellow Vest USA.
And support independent media.
Yeah, and support independent media, the PDA. Check out buildthefloor.org. and also Andrew Yang, Bernie Sanders. I mean, we all need to build these coalitions and start moving forward. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Any closing comments?
Well, just Progressive Democrats of America, PDA, check us out. And again, don't buy. What did Spike Lee say in that beautiful Bernie Sanders ad back in 2016? Don't accept the old okey doke. You can tell who's on the right side of things. So.
Exactly.
And if people want to find me on Twitter at Larry Cohen, buildthefloor.org is my site. And I look forward to creating these coalitions and working together with many groups and speaking to you more in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
And this is Niswander. You've been watching The Nowman Show. Stay present, always.
The past is gone, the future is yet to come, it's now, right now. The present is here, the future is near, but it's right now. You know, being with you makes the party complete. So keep the body moving and show us your happy feet. At the end of the night, when all is said and done, I wanna know I did the right thing and had a lot of fun.